Picture this for a moment. You're in your favorite study spot, the place you go to think, to work, to escape from the world. You know every corner of it, every sound it makes, every shadow it casts. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the soft whisper of pages turning, the comforting weight of knowledge surrounding you on all sides. It's your sanctuary, your second home. But what happens when that safe haven decides it doesn't want to let you go? This story comes from Japan, where the boundaries between the academic world and the supernatural have always been thinner than most people realize. University libraries, with their centuries of accumulated knowledge and countless hours of human dedication, sometimes develop a consciousness of their own. They begin to hunger for more than just books and papers. They start collecting the people who love them most. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about being trapped in a building overnight. It's about the slow realization that some places form attachments to us, and sometimes those attachments become obsessions. This is the story of Miyu Tanaka, a graduate student who thought she understood the library where she spent her nights. She believed she was just another researcher, another temporary visitor passing through. But the library had been watching her, learning from her, and it had decided she belonged to something far more permanent than any thesis or degree. Whether you believe what happened to her or not, her story serves as a reminder that knowledge has its own kind of hunger, and some institutions will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve what they consider valuable. It was a Thursday evening in late November when Miyu Tanaka pushed through the heavy glass doors of the old academic wing. For what would be the last time as a free person. The building dated back to 1923, surviving earthquakes and renovations, while newer, brighter sections sprouted around it like modern growths on an ancient tree. Most students avoided this wing entirely, preferring the sleek computer labs and climate-controlled study rooms in the contemporary buildings. But Miyu found comfort in the old place, with its high ceilings, wooden shelves that creaked when the wind picked up, and the particular smell of aged paper and binding glue that seemed to permeate everything. She was 24 years old, in her second year of graduate studies in comparative literature, working on a thesis that examined the evolution of Japanese folklore in post-war academic discourse. It was specialized work that required access to rare collections and archived materials, the kind of research that kept her buried in dusty volumes while her classmates finished their studies in digital databases. The old wing housed exactly the resources she needed, and more importantly, it offered the kind of deep silence that allowed her to think clearly. Miyu had developed a routine over the past 8 months. She would arrive each evening around 7, claim her usual desk in the southeast corner near the tall windows, and spread out her notes and books in careful, organized piles. The desk faced away from the main reading area, giving her a view of the narrow aisles that stretched deep into the building's interior. From her spot, she could see the forbidden reference section, marked off by a rusted chain and a sign that read, "Restricted access, faculty permission required." She'd never been curious enough to venture past that barrier, content with the materials available in the general collection. The evening staff knew her by sight now. Mrs. Ogawa, the elderly circulation librarian, would nod approvingly when Miyu checked out her daily stack of books, sometimes commenting on her dedication or asking gentle questions about her research progress. The security guard, Mr. Yamamoto, would make his rounds every few hours, his soft footsteps and jingling keys providing a rhythmic backdrop to her studies. By 10:30, she was usually alone, except for the occasional graduate student or dedicated professor working late in distant corners of the building. Tonight felt different from the moment she settled into her chair. The building seemed quieter than usual, the typical sounds of settling wood and humming ventilation systems muted to an almost imperceptible whisper. Even the rain, which had been pattering against the windows all day, seemed to have softened to the barest touch of moisture on glass. Miyu attributed the strange atmosphere to her own exhaustion. She'd been pushing herself hard for weeks, trying to finish a crucial chapter before her advisor's deadline, surviving on coffee and determination while her sleep schedule grew increasingly irregular. She pulled out her laptop and opened the document she'd been working on, a complex analysis of how traditional ghost stories had been recontextualized in academic literature during the 1950s. The irony of spending her nights researching supernatural folklore in a building that felt increasingly haunted itself wasn't lost on her, but she'd always been practical about such things. Ghosts were metaphors, symbols of cultural anxiety and historical trauma. They existed in stories and academic papers, not in the real world of fluorescent lights and card catalogs. As the hours passed, Miyu fell into the familiar rhythm of research and writing. She moved between her desk and the nearby shelves, pulling volumes and cross-referencing sources, building her argument one citation at a time. The building's sounds faded into background noise, the kind of ambient audio that actually helped her concentrate. Occasionally, she would hear footsteps in distant corridors or the soft thud of books being reshelved, but these sounds only reinforced her sense of being part of a larger academic community, even in the late hours. It wasn't until she glanced at her phone that she realized how late it had become. The display showed 11:52 p.m., which meant the library would be closing in just a few minutes. She began gathering her materials with practiced efficiency, sliding books into neat piles and saving her work with quick keystrokes. The building would remain open for another few minutes, giving her time to check out any books she needed and make her way to the exit before the security shutters came down. But as she stood up from her desk, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of sitting, she noticed something that made her pause. The usual sounds of closing time were absent. No announcements over the intercom, no distant voices of staff members securing the building, no jingle of keys as security made their final rounds. The silence was so complete, it seemed to have weight, pressing against her eardrums with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of her own heartbeat. Miyu checked her phone again. 11:58 p.m. The library should have been bustling with closing activities, but the building felt abandoned, as if she were the only living person left in the entire structure. She packed her remaining items quickly and walked toward the main circulation desk, her footsteps echoing strangely in the empty space. The sound seemed to bounce off invisible walls, creating an odd layering effect that made it difficult to judge distances accurately. The circulation desk was empty, Mrs. Ogawa's computer screen dark, and her chair pushed neatly under the counter. Miyu called out softly, not wanting to disturb anyone who might still be working in distant sections, but her voice seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding shelves without producing even the faintest echo. She walked toward the main entrance, her unease growing with each step as the familiar layout of the building seemed somehow altered, the proportions slightly wrong in ways she couldn't quite identify. When she reached the glass doors that led to the main corridor, her heart sank. The heavy security shutters had already descended, their metal surfaces reflecting the dim interior lighting like dark mirrors. She tried the door handles anyway, pulling and pushing with increasing desperation, but they remained firmly locked. The electronic card reader beside the doors showed a red light, indicating that the building's security system had already engaged for the night. Miyu pulled out her phone to call campus security, but the screen showed no signal bars. That was impossible. The university had installed signal boosters throughout all academic buildings just 2 years ago, ensuring that students and faculty could always reach emergency services. She walked back toward the center of the building, holding her phone up and watching the display, but the signal strength remained at 0. When she checked the available wireless networks, she found something that made her blood run cold. Instead of the usual university Wi-Fi options, her phone displayed a single network she'd never seen before. library_internal_archive. The network name felt like a message, though she couldn't understand what it was trying to tell her. She clicked on it instinctively, watching as her phone connected without requiring a password. For a moment, her screen displayed what looked like a digital catalog system, rows of entries with dates and numbers she didn't recognize. But when she tried to scroll through the listings, the connection dropped and her phone returned to showing no available networks at all. Standing alone in the vast reading room, Miyu forced herself to think logically. Campus security would make their rounds eventually, and when they found her trapped inside, they would let her out. The electronic locks were probably malfunctioning, a simple technical problem that would seem foolish in the morning light. She just needed to wait patiently and try not to let her imagination run wild in the meantime. She decided to return to her desk and continue working, using the time productively rather than pacing around the empty building like a caged animal. The familiar routine of research would calm her nerves and help the hours pass more quickly. As she walked back through the reading room, her footsteps seemed to echo differently than before, the sound bouncing off the high ceiling in patterns that created strange harmonics. She found herself walking more quietly, though she couldn't explain why the noise of her own movement had begun to feel intrusive. Her desk looked exactly as she'd left it, books stacked in neat piles and her laptop still open to the document she'd been working on. But as she settled back into her chair, she noticed something that made her pause. The cursor was blinking at the bottom of a paragraph she didn't remember writing. The text was in her academic style, using the same formal language and citation format she developed over months of work, but the content was unfamiliar. It discussed a collection of folklore manuscripts that she'd never encountered in her research, referencing call numbers from what appeared to be the restricted section. Miyu scrolled up through the document, her confusion growing as she found several paragraphs of similar material woven seamlessly into her existing work. The additions were scholarly and well-written, but they cited sources she'd never seen and made arguments she'd never formulated. It was as if someone had been continuing her research while she was away from her desk, someone who understood her thesis better than she understood it herself. She checked the document's revision history, but it showed only her own user account making changes, with timestamps from throughout the evening. According to the computer, she had been actively writing and editing continuously, even during the times when she remembered walking to the shelves or stretching her legs. The last recorded change had been made just 3 minutes ago. While she was standing at the locked entrance trying to find a way out, a chill ran down her spine as she realized the implications. Either she was losing time somehow, working without conscious awareness of what she was doing, or something else was accessing her computer and continuing her research. Neither possibility offered much comfort, and both suggested that her situation was far more serious than a simple case of being accidentally locked in after hours. She closed the laptop and stood up, deciding that staying at her desk was making her more anxious rather than less. The building was large enough that she could explore for a while, maybe find another exit or at least locate a working phone line. The old wing had multiple floors and several entrances, and surely not all of them would be sealed for the night. As she moved away from her familiar corner, the reading room seemed to stretch out around her like an ocean of shelves and shadows. The further she walked from her desk, the more the library's geography seemed to shift and blur. Aisles that she thought led toward the main staircase instead curved back toward the center of the building. Familiar landmarks like the reference desk and the periodical section appeared in unexpected locations, as if the entire floor plan was slowly rearranging itself when she wasn't looking directly at specific areas. She began to suspect that her stress and exhaustion were affecting her perception, making her confused about directions in a building she thought she knew intimately. but then she heard something that stopped her cold. From somewhere deep in the stacks, barely audible above the building's ambient noise, came the sound of pages turning, not the quick flutter of someone skimming through a book, but the deliberate, measured rhythm of careful reading. Each page turn was followed by a pause, as if someone was taking time to absorb and consider the contents before moving on to the next section. Miyu called out softly, hoping to find another person who might be able to help her, or at least provide some human companionship in the increasingly unsettling environment. Her voice seemed to be absorbed by the surrounding books without producing any response, but the page turning continued, steady and methodical. She followed the sound deeper into the stacks, past sections of the collection she rarely visited, through narrow aisles lined with volumes on subjects far removed from her own research interests. The sound led her to the restricted section, where the rusted chain still hung across the entrance like a symbolic barrier. Beyond it, she could see rows of older shelves stretching back into shadows that the overhead lighting didn't quite reach. The page turning was definitely coming from somewhere past the chain, and as she stood listening, she realized there might be multiple sources of the sound, as if several people were reading simultaneously in the forbidden areas of the collection. Against every instinct telling her to respect the library's rules and boundaries, Miyu stepped over the chain. If there were other people in the building, she needed to find them, regardless of whether they were supposed to be in restricted areas. The page turning grew louder as she moved deeper into the section, but she still couldn't locate the source. The sound seemed to come from all around her, echoing off the tightly packed shelves in ways that made it impossible to triangulate its origin. The books in this section were older than anything in the general collection, bound in leather and cloth that showed the wear of decades or centuries of handling. Many of the titles were in languages she couldn't read, and the call number system seemed to follow a different organizational scheme than the one used in the rest of the library. As she walked between the shelves, she noticed that several volumes were lying open on the floor, as if they had been pulled from the shelves and abandoned in the middle of reading sessions. She knelt beside one of the open books, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The text was in Japanese, but the characters were written in an archaic style that made them difficult to decipher. What she could understand seemed to be discussing the relationship between physical spaces and human consciousness, describing how certain locations could develop awareness of their inhabitants over time. The margins were filled with handwritten notes in modern Japanese, comments and observations that appeared to be responses to the historical text. As she studied the annotations, a terrible realization began to form. The handwriting looked familiar, similar to her own academic notes, but not quite identical. It was as if someone had been carefully studying and copying her writing style, practicing until they could replicate it almost perfectly. The dates on some of the margin notes went back several months, long before she had ever entered the restricted section or even known of its existence. The page turning around her grew more intense, the sound multiplying until it became like rainfall against leaves. But when she looked up from the book, she couldn't see anyone else in the narrow aisles. The sound was there, constant and undeniable, but its source remained invisible. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding as she realized that whatever was making the noise was not entirely human, or at least not human in any way she could understand. That's when she heard her own voice speaking behind her. The words were clear and familiar, fragments from the thesis introduction she'd written months ago, but the cadence was wrong, too slow, too deliberate, as if each syllable was being carefully examined before being released into the air. Miyu spun around, but the aisle behind her remained empty except for the scattered open books and the persistent sound of invisible pages turning. The intersection of folklore and academic discourse, her voice continued from somewhere she couldn't locate, reveals the permeable boundary between documented history and lived experience. The words echoed strangely in the narrow space, bouncing off the tightly packed shelves with an acoustic quality that made them seem to come from multiple directions at once. She pressed herself against the nearest bookshelf, her breathing shallow and rapid. The familiar sentences from her own work sounded alien when spoken by whatever presence inhabited this restricted section. Each word was pronounced with perfect clarity, but there was something hollow about the delivery, as if the speaker understood the meaning of the words without truly comprehending their significance. The voice moved through her thesis systematically, reciting paragraphs she'd struggled to perfect over weeks of careful revision. But interwoven with her own academic language were passages she didn't recognize, discussions of concepts that seemed to extend far beyond her research scope. The unknown voice spoke of libraries as living entities, of books as vessels for consciousness, of the symbiotic relationship between knowledge and those who seek it. Miyu pulled out her phone, desperate to record this impossible phenomenon, but the screen remained dark despite her repeated attempts to turn it on. The device felt cold in her hands, as if all warmth and energy had been drained from its circuits. She slipped it back into her pocket and focused on listening, trying to understand what was happening in this forgotten corner of the library. The recitation continued for several more minutes before gradually fading to silence. The page-turning sounds also diminished, becoming softer and more sporadic, until they too disappeared entirely. The sudden quiet was more unsettling than the strange voices had been, creating a vacuum of sound that seemed to press against her eardrums with uncomfortable intensity. She waited in the darkness for what felt like an eternity before finally working up the courage to move. Her footsteps sounded unnaturally loud as she made her way back toward the chain barrier, each step echoing with a hollow quality that suggested the space around her was much larger than the narrow aisles indicated. When she reached the entrance to the restricted section, she turned back for one final look at the area where she'd heard her own voice speaking. The open books that had been scattered across the floor were gone. The shelves stood in perfect order, every volume in its proper place, as if no one had disturbed the collection in years. But on the floor where the books had been lying, she could see faint impressions in the dust, circular patterns that suggested something had been arranged there recently and then carefully removed. Miyu stepped back over the chain and returned to the main reading area, her mind struggling to process what she'd experienced. The logical part of her brain insisted that exhaustion and stress were creating auditory hallucinations, that the strange voices and moving books were products of an overworked imagination. But the sensory details had been too precise, too consistent to dismiss as mere psychological phenomena. As she made her way back to her desk through the seemingly endless rows of shelves, Miyu noticed something that made her stop completely. The clock on the wall read 11:58 p.m. again, the same time she'd first tried to leave. She checked her phone, but the screen remained dark, unresponsive to her touch, no matter how many times she pressed the power button. The building around her felt different now, as if the very architecture was shifting when she wasn't paying attention. Corridors stretched longer than they should, and familiar sections appeared in impossible locations. She found herself walking in circles, each path leading back to the restricted section, no matter which direction she chose to go. Then she heard footsteps, not the measured rhythm of security making rounds, but something softer, more deliberate, the sound of someone wearing fabric shoes, moving with the practiced silence of someone who belonged in this space completely. From the shadows between the tall shelves emerged a figure that made Miyu's breath catch in her throat. It was a woman in her 60s wearing a dark blue cardigan and white cotton gloves of the type librarians use to handle delicate materials. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face held the calm, professional expression of someone who had spent decades helping students find exactly what they needed. She looked completely normal, utterly unremarkable, except for her eyes, which seemed to hold depths that extended far beyond what any human gaze should contain. "Did you find what you were looking for?" the woman asked, her voice carrying the same measured cadence as the mysterious recitation Miyu had heard earlier. The question felt loaded with meaning that went far beyond simple library assistance. "I just want to go home," Miyu whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast space around them. "The doors are locked, and I can't get out." The librarian smiled with gentle understanding, the expression of someone explaining a simple concept to a confused child. "You can't leave once you've been cited," she said softly. "The collection has already catalogued you." She gestured toward a desk that hadn't been there moments before, where an enormous leather-bound ledger lay open under a pool of warm lamplight. The pages were filled with names written in elegant script, each entry accompanied by dates and call numbers that followed no organizational system Miyu recognized. Near the bottom of the visible page, in ink that still looked wet, was her own name, Tanaka Miyu. The space beneath it remained blank, waiting. "Every library develops its own consciousness over time," the woman continued, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the wooden floor. "Decades of human thought and dedication, thousands of minds contributing their knowledge and passion. Eventually, that accumulated intellectual energy becomes something more than the sum of its parts." Miyu backed away, but the shelves behind her seemed to shift and close, creating walls where moments before there had been open aisles. The familiar geography of the building was dissolving around her, replaced by something that followed its own internal logic. "You've been coming here every night for 8 months, the librarian said, her voice carrying a note of appreciation, "contributing your thoughts, your research, your dedication to understanding. The collection values that kind of commitment. It wants to preserve it permanently." From between the shelves, figures began to emerge. They moved with the rustling sound of paper being shuffled, and as they came closer, Miyu could see they were constructed entirely from pages torn from books, human-shaped collages of text and illustrations, their faces blank spaces where words should have been. They carried notebooks and pens, moving with the purposeful air of researchers heading to their designated study areas. "Previous acquisitions," the librarian explained matter-of-factly. "Graduate students primarily, though we have a few professors from earlier decades. They continue their research, of course. Time works differently here, so there's no pressure to meet external deadlines." The paper figures arranged themselves in a circle around Miyu, their rustling growing louder as more pages seemed to fold and unfold themselves into new configurations. She could hear fragments of academic discussions, thesis defenses, and research presentations layered together in a whispered chorus that filled the air with the sound of intellectual activity. "Your work will be preserved forever," the librarian continued. "Your insights, your discoveries, your unique perspective on folklore and academic discourse. Isn't that what every researcher dreams of? To have their work become part of something larger and more permanent than themselves?" Miyu tried to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The paper figures moved closer, their blank faces tilting toward her with something that might have been curiosity or hunger. She could feel pages brushing against her skin, soft and insistent, trying to wrap around her arms and legs like bandages. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was asking for. Her voice seemed to echo strangely in the space, bouncing off invisible surfaces and returning to her ears distorted and unfamiliar. The librarian reached into her cardigan and pulled out a fountain pen, its nib gleaming in the lamplight. "Just sign the ledger," she said gently. "Complete your cataloging. Then you can begin your real work." The paper figures pressed closer, their rustling becoming a roar like wind through autumn leaves. Miyu felt herself being lifted, carried toward the desk where the ledger waited. The pen was placed in her hand, its weight surprising and final. As she looked down at the blank line beneath her name, the last thing she remembered was the sound of pages turning, growing louder and faster until it drowned out everything else. The next morning, campus security found the old library wing open as usual. Everything appeared normal except for one small detail that went unnoticed by the maintenance staff. On Miyu's usual desk in the southeast corner, her notebook lay open to a page that hadn't been there the day before. Her thesis was complete, typed in perfect academic format with citations to sources that didn't exist in any catalog. Her advisor received the finished work by email that afternoon, though the timestamp showed it had been sent from a computer that had been powered off for over 12 hours. When he tried to contact Miyu to discuss her brilliant conclusions about the intersection of folklore and institutional memory, he discovered that her student ID had been transferred to the library's Special Collections Archive. The administrative staff assumed it was a clerical error, but no one could locate her in any current enrollment records. It was as if she had never been a student at all, existing only as a reference in the university's vast informational database filed away under subjects that would be useful for future researchers to discover. And sometimes, late at night, students working alone in the old wing report, hearing the soft sound of pages turning in the restricted section, accompanied by whispered discussions of research topics that seemed to extend far beyond any single thesis or academic discipline. But they never investigate the sounds too closely. Something about the rhythm of those turning pages suggests that certain kinds of knowledge are best left undisturbed, and some collections are more complete than they appear.